long interest in the story and the history of the hanging in Detroit that was Stephen Gifford Simmons. And so tonight, he's willing to share that experience with us and also to sign his book later if anyone wishes to purchase it. Before we do that, Virginia Presson wanted to have a few words, and so I will turn the floor to Virginia.
I just wanted to make a little announcement here. I'm glad to see you all here tonight. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, whether you might have seen it in the paper or on cable. I don't even know if it was on either one. It was supposed to be. That the museum got a CAP grant, which was a fairly generous one. And that's what it is as a conservation assessment plan. And we are having 2 people come next week. One lady is going to assess the building inside and out. The other one is going to assess the contents of the building. The one who is doing the contents is very interested in preservation. And she told me that she just loves to talk. She likes an audience. And she wanted me to get some people. She said even if it's just 2 or 3. But I think we can get more than that. So as far as I know right now, probably next Wednesday about 4 o'clock in the afternoon would be a good time. If any of you have any pictures, books, photographs, any kind of thing that you're keeping and want to take care of, and you would like to have some information on possibly how you can do a better job of it, and even if you don't have anything, come on and listen to the lady. She wants an audience. So if the time or date changes, I'll try to let everybody know. I'm going to pass around, or I think I'll put over on the table a paper, and if you are interested, put your name and phone number on it so that I can contact you in case we have to change the time. But that was what I wanted to let you know. It doesn't take the place of a historical society meeting, but it certainly falls under our historical program. So let's see as many of you as are interested next Wednesday.
Is that here or there?
That's at the museum.
Okay.
Thank you, Virginia. And we are especially fortunate to have Mr. Chardavoyne with us tonight because it's his birthday. So fortunately, the Historical Museum brought us.
If you don't mind, I'm going to take off my jacket. Because it's kind of warm here. I'm going to be moving around. I'm going to talk from the podium because I'm a lawyer and I'm used to doing that. I'm also going to try to move around some. I have some illustrations. Unfortunately, we have no way of projecting them anywhere, so I'm going to try to show them to you. If they'll be around later, if you want to take a look at them. And certainly at the end, I'll take any questions you have as long as you want. Well, first about me. Why not? David Chardavoyne. I'm a lawyer. I live in Farmington Hills. I graduated from the University of Michigan with a bachelor's degree in 1970 and from Wayne State University Law School in 1976. And I practiced in a firm in Detroit for 20 years. Now I'm practicing on my own, but I also do other things that are really becoming very important to me. One of them is writing this book. I also write for some historical publications, legal historical publications. I teach at Wayne State University Law School and at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law as an adjunct, part-time, in both of those places. My wife is a doctor. She has her office in Wixom, and I have 2 sons who are 16 and 13. So that's about me. Now, about the book. People always ask me, how did you start writing about this subject? And the answer is a couple things. One, when I was in law school, I was on a law review. I was editor of the law review. And the other students had to come up with subjects to write their law review articles on. And one of my friends, David Melkus, thought about writing an article about Simmons' execution and the abolition of capital punishment in Michigan. And he went and did a lot of research and came back and said, well, it really wasn't something he wanted to do as a law review article, but he told me a lot of stories. And those stories stayed in my mind. So when I did leave the law firm and had more time, I started thinking about writing maybe an article for Michigan history, really sort of optimistic that I could get that done. And so I started going to places to look for research. I read the standard story, which is in George Catlin's book, The Story of Detroit, in the 1920s. I went to your historical museum. I went to the Burton collection at the Detroit Public Library. And it became apparent to me fairly soon that there were facts about the story that had never been told, and a lot of the facts that had been told didn't seem to be correct. So that sort of drew me in. And I just started writing and doing research. And I would research at the Burton collection. And by the way, we're very lucky in this area to have a number of great places to do historical research. The Bentley Library on the North Campus of the University of Michigan has a tremendous Supreme Court collection and also papers of very many different families from Michigan history. The State Archives of Michigan in Lansing have not just originals, but a great microfilm collection. For example, I found the probate records of Mr. Simmons' probate estate on microfilm at the State Archives. Across the way from the State Archives is the Library of Michigan, which has also a tremendous collection both of books and of microfilm. It has the complete census microfilm, has things you would never imagine, all of which can be accessed, at least in terms of finding out what's there on the internet. Their catalog is available on the internet. And going up to people are very friendly and very helpful. It's also the Clements Library on the main campus of the University of Michigan, which has a more general historical collection. So there are very many places to look. Being a lawyer, I also looked in some places that maybe people before, Mr. Catlin, who was the librarian of the Detroit News, may not have thought to look. The first place I looked was real estate records. I wanted to find out if there's anything more I could learn about Mr. Simmons than the fact that he was hanged in Detroit, that he had a tavern here in Wayne. What else did I know about him? Well, I went to the real estate records and found his name, and found that when he bought property in Michigan for the first time in 1825, he put down in the deed that he was from Chenango County, New York. Well, interesting. Went to the histories of Chenango County, New York. Indeed, there were references to him in the two standard histories, which are both 100 plus years old. I called up a lawyer in the county seat, Chenango County, asked him if he would, for a fee, send his clerk over to the clerk's office there and pull down every real estate record they could find mentioning Mr. Simmons, and later his family, because it turned out that his family had a lot of property interest in that county. And he was able to bring me a stack of deeds, copies of deeds going back to the 1700s, that thick. From those, I was able to trace his family back to New York City. His father was a tavern owner himself in New York City, at a tavern that was very popular during the Revolutionary period, across the street from Federal Hall, where the Congress sat during the post-revolutionary period. And so there was information I could find from New York sources about his father and about his family. And this went on and on and on. Every time I think I got everything I could possibly find, something else would drop. One day I was at the Burton collection and was looking at their new books up on the shelf. And one of them was from the Christ Church, Philadelphia. And it was baptisms at Christ Church from 1750 to 1800. Well, I knew that Mr. Simmons had been born sometime between 1770 and 1790. And so, but I had no reason to think he had anything to do with Philadelphia. He was from New York. That was his family's from New York. That's where his brothers were. That's where his family was. So I just reflexively pulled it out and looked at the index, and there was a Simmons, Simmonds. Instead of being Stephen Gifford, it was Gifford Stephen. Well, I looked it up and found out that his parents of this person who was baptized were John and Catherine, the same names as our Stephen Gifford Simmons. And although the spelling of the last name was different, you often find that because in those days when they would write an S, they make a big flourish at the end. And very often people nowadays misread that as a D. So it's O-N-D-S rather than O-N-S. And often the names get reversed. So Stephen Gifford becomes Gifford Stephen. But I became convinced that was indeed his baptismal certificate in Philadelphia in early February of 1780. Why was he in Philadelphia? Why was he baptized in Philadelphia? Well, when you think about it, that was during a time when the British were occupying New York. His father and his brothers were on the American side. His brothers were in the Army. One of his brothers was an accountant in the Army, but still in the Army. His father had served for a very short period of time at the beginning of the war. So clearly they would not have been welcome in New York City at that time. And so they fled with most of the American people who were on the American revolutionary side and didn't go back until the British left. So they were in Philadelphia, I think possibly living actually across the river in Trenton with his father's brother. But I can't guarantee that, but there is this connection. One of his children, one of Stephen Gifford Simmons' children was named Bathsheba. Interesting name. It also happened to be the name of his uncle's wife. Well, it seemed to me likely that if he had spent some time with that family, he would very likely have named one of his daughters after his aunt. So I supposed and presumed, in fact, that's where the family was living when they were in exile from New York, at least for part of the time. And so facts just kept developing and developing and developing. Up until the time that the Wayne State University Press made me stop, I was still finding things. I'm sure there's still stuff out there to find. I just have run out of, one, time, and two, places to think to look. But I'm sure that in 20 or 30 years from now, someone else will come up with a book that says, I'm all wrong. Okay, let's talk about the story. In his History of England, Thomas Macaulay said, if we would study with profit the history of our ancestors, we must never forget the country of which we read is a very different country from that in which we live. And it's true. When we read about Detroit in 1825, 1830, or Wayne in that period, entirely different place from the place we live in, obviously. Well, let's just try to give some context of the time. So Stephen Simmons was hanged in 1830, September 24th, 173 years, 2 weeks from tonight. In 1830, George IV was King of England. Victoria, who became Queen, was a 11-year-old princess who was so far down in the line of succession in England that no one thought she would ever be anything. Abraham Lincoln was 21 years old. Charles Dickens was 18, had not written anything. Mark Twain wouldn't be born for 5 years. In 1825, when the Simmons family moved here to Michigan, to Wayne, John Quincy Adams was the president. In 1830, when Stephen Simmons was executed, the president was Andrew Jackson. If you think about it, if you look at the Civil War as being something that for us happened a long, long time ago, not only would Stephen Simmons not have been eligible to fight the Civil War, his sons would have been too old. His grandsons, if he had any, we don't know, would barely have been young enough to fight in that war. That's how long ago we're talking about. Well, what about Stephen Simmons? He was born in, I think, January of 1780, during the Revolution, as I said. His parents were John and Catherine. They owned a tavern on Wall Street, at the corner of Wall Street in Nassau. We even have a picture of it. easily, I'm not really drawing anyway. Hey, this is not the best way of showing these, but little tavern in between Federal Hall and the Presbyterian Church on Wall Street. It was very popular with people. A lot of civic meetings took place there. The first American mayor of New York was inaugurated in that tavern. John and Catherine had 6 children that we know of. Stephen was the second youngest. Only his sister Catherine, who was the only girl, was younger than he was. His brothers were much older. So when he was born in 1780, his brothers John and William were already in the Revolutionary Army. So he was sort of the surprise baby. He and Catherine were sort of the surprise babies, and it shows in their father's will. He was much more interested in their welfare than he was in that of his older sons. The family, we think, returned to New York about the time that the Americans re-entered, and we're pretty sure that, in fact, his father John was on the American side, because at the time that the Americans were re-entering, there was a big committee meeting of people who were staunch patriots and who wanted to celebrate this event, and they had a meeting that excluded anyone who had stayed in the city during the British occupation. And it seems to me illogical to think that they would have held their meeting at a place of someone who stayed in the city and who was not a patriot, if they excluded those people from their meetings. I assume that John was, on the American side. There's indications that he was in a militia unit at the beginning of the war, before New York was taken. Probably not the best soldier. When he died in 1795, he was described in the newspapers as the fattest man in America. They actually had to take the bay window out of the front of their house to get him out with his casket to bury him. He was quite a wealthy man. He owned property. He had been involved in a cartel with a number of New York politicians who bought several thousand acres of land in Shenango County, talked about before, which is to the west of Cooperstown. When you've been to the Baseball Hall of Fame, it's in the hills to the west of there. They bought it as speculation, thinking that in good time the flow of settlers to the west would mean there would be a lot of people to buy up small parcels of what they had bought. They bought full sections of that land and then couldn't sell it for the longest time. In the time that John Sr. died, his son was advertising the property for sale in the Cooperstown papers, and apparently getting no takers, because if you look at the deeds, there simply are very few deeds at all selling any of that property. That was a problem a lot of people had at that time. Land speculation is as American as apple pie, and was at that time too. Lots of people got in trouble. Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton were two famous people who got in trouble, almost went bankrupt from land speculation at that time. Luckily for John, he was somehow able to weather that period, and when he died, as I said, he was quite wealthy. But when he died, Stephen was only 15 years old. John's will says that he left money to provide Stephen with a set of tools so he could become a mechanic, suggesting that Stephen may not have been the smartest person, or maybe not a person you would think of as a clerk or a priest or something else who would need a lot of education. Instead of becoming a mechanic, though, Stephen, who was a very tall, broad-shouldered young man by that time, got a commission in the United States Army in 1797 when he was 17 years old. He actually went into the dragoons, the cavalry. If you look here, this green uniform, the white pants there in the middle picture, is the uniform of the dragoons at that time. Now, it was hard to get a commission in the dragoons because there were only 2 companies of them in the whole army. That was the entire U.S. cavalry at that time, about 100 men. And because Congress was even cutting back further, a few officers were buying out. In fact, he got a commission because one of the young lieutenants, who had actually been at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, decided he had enough. And he bought out, and somehow, we don't know exactly how, although His brother William by this time was in the War Department, so it may have been through William. He got this commission, and he was trained in Philadelphia for a short time, and then he was sent to the Knoxville, Tennessee area, where he was involved in convoying settlers along the Cumberland Trail, keeping them away from bandits mostly. The Army at that time was more of a police force. It was scattered in small little packets all around the country, up and down the coast. There were no large units. So he was probably with a group of maybe 60 men. We know something about that because some of his Army records do survive. In the National Archives in Washington, you can find muster rolls. Which every month they had to all muster, and their names were read out. If they were there, they were marked present. And his name shows up for a period of time. And in 1 month, he was actually in charge. He was 17 and a half years old. He was in charge of the company. And he had to sign the muster roll. And when I saw that signature, I just sort of jumped up, because it's the same signature that he used 30 years later to sign his tavern license here in Wayne. So I knew it was the same person. It's a very significant signature. In any case, he was in the Knoxville area for about a year. And then mysteriously, he was promoted to regimental paymaster and transferred back to Philadelphia, which was the headquarters. This was a time when the Army was being built up again because there was a fear of an invasion by France. Now, how France was going to do that, nobody really ever said, but Congress got very scared and authorized a huge number of extra units. There was going to be a 6-regiment group of dragoons, and he was going to be the paymaster at age 18. About a year and a half later, he was back in Knoxville and under arrest. And he was dismissed from the Army in November of 1800. We don't know why. I've not been able to find out any records, but it's clearly he was dismissed and not discharged. Some of you smiled when I said there were only 2 troops of cavalry in the entire United States Army in 1797. In 1802, there were none. In 1802, Thomas Jefferson wiped out the entire U.S. cavalry because he thought that they were a luxury he didn't want to pay for. But those people, when they were left the Army, were discharged, honorably discharged. He was dismissed. Something happened to this young man. It may have been because he was paymaster, but we don't know. What we do know is from later comments from his family, he lived a rather dissolute life in Knoxville. Imagine here's a young man who grew up in a tavern. He's away from his family probably for the first time. He's among men who were, unfortunately, some of the scum of the earth, because that's the only people who would be in the Army at that time. The pay was very low. A lot of officers made more money with the vegetables they grew around the fort than they did in what they were paid. The men ate beef and bread, which usually was rotten. The beer that they got was watered down. There was a tremendous amount of corruption in the procurement process, which, interestingly enough, his brother William was involved in back in Philadelphia. But Knoxville at that time was not a frontier town. It had a university, it had newspapers, but it was pretty rough and tumble. Fighting and drinking and other things the young men like to do were very prevalent there. And I have no doubt that Stephen learned a lot of bad habits. And that was sort of the feeling of people later on when they're writing about him at the time he was executed, that was a period of time when he somehow learned to be a bad man. He got involved with alcohol, he got involved with loose women and with thieves, and he was never the same. After his dismissal in 1800, there's really nothing in the record that I found until 1815. I don't know what he was doing in between, except I do know that at some point he got married and had children, because we can tell from the property records in Shenandoah County in 1815 that he had a wife named Levana, Levana. That was significant because until we saw that in the property records, no one knew what her name was. She was killed here, she was murdered, and in every record from that period, it was always the wife. The wife was killed, he was hanged for killing the wife, her name never came up. It wasn't until I looked at the property record in Pennsylvania when I saw that she had to sign when they sold property. Obviously, she wasn't part of buying property, heavens no. But when they sold property, the dower rules, the dower laws required her signature in order to make the transfer legal. Otherwise, she could claim a third of the property if her signature was not. Therefore, there it was, Levanus Simmons. We know from his will that he made the night before he was executed that he had also 6 children. And from other evidence, we know that some of them were born around 1806, 1807, and then sort of came along until about 1815. At 1815, we know that he was given some of the property, or bought some of the property from his father's estate. The deed signed by his brother William, who was the personal representative of the estate, the executor. William at this time was still in the federal service. He was still in the War Department. The capital was now Washington, D.C., no longer Philadelphia or New York, and William signed the deeds, had them notarized by one of the Supreme Court justices, and sent them off to Chenango County. So Stephen now had parcel of land. It wasn't a very good parcel of land. I actually went to Chenango County and walked around to see where his property was. It wasn't very good property, and according to the stories that are still told around there, and some of the old histories there, he was not a very good farmer either. He and his brother John Jr. were there, and for 10 years, John for longer, and they never really got the hang of being a farmer. It's tough land. If you've ever seen the N.C. Wyeth paintings or paintings like from the Deerstalker or from Last of the Mohicans, with these great hills with timber and rocks all over the place, that's Chenango County. The only things they grow there today, they grow some wheat, and a lot of root crops, a lot of carrots and turnips and potatoes, because it's much higher altitude than, say, Cooperstown, much shorter growing season. It's a tough place to be a farmer. Stephen and his family stuck it out for 10 years. At one point in about 1828, William decided to finally distribute the entire rest of the father's estate. And Stephen traveled to Washington, where he met with his brother William. Brother John was off in Indiana, but there were other members of the family. And they divvied up the land in Chenango County that was left. So now Stephen had another stake. He had sold a lot of the property he had bought in 1815, probably to pay to keep his family alive. He tended to sell things in the spring when they would have used up whatever they grew the summer before. In Albany, during the winter, they would have needed cash to buy more food. He would sell a little bit every spring. Now he had a lot more, and he started selling it again. And then, for reasons we don't really know, in 1825, he decided to move to Michigan. The family decided that they would no longer be from New York, Chenango County, but they would move to Detroit. 1825 happens to be the time that the Erie Canal was open. And that may have been a big reason why they moved. Up until that time, getting to Michigan was hard. Getting to Ohio, particularly southern Ohio, all you had to do was go over the mountains and get to the Ohio River and float down the Ohio River. And for that reason, Cincinnati and Louisville were developed decades before Michigan was. People would move north from there, but in Michigan, you couldn't get here easily. You couldn't get here by land because of the Great Black Swamp. If any of you have ever driven from, say, Cedar Point Amusement Park, not along the expressway, but along the road that is along the lake, you'll see it's nothing but swamp. It's very wet, and that's after it was drained. In those days, there was a swamp that went from essentially Cedar Point out past the end of Lake Erie and about 15 miles south of there. It was impassable except during the winter when everything froze over. It could take days to get through there, and you get lost. So getting to Michigan by land is almost impossible. Very difficult in any case. Getting there by water was much easier, but nevertheless took a long time. To get through from New York City to Detroit could easily take a month, 6 weeks before the Erie Canal. You would take a steamboat from New York up the Hudson to Albany, Then you would get off and you would take a stagecoach. The roads were muddy, taverns were awful, and it could take you 4 weeks to get from Albany to Buffalo. Once you got to Buffalo, then you had to go often by steamship, because there were no, by sailing, there were no steamships until 1819. And that might take you another 2 weeks to get from Buffalo to Detroit along Lake Erie and up the Detroit River. So getting to Detroit, getting to Michigan was very difficult. And for that reason, even by 1830, Detroit had a population of only about 2,000 souls. The other thing that held back development in Michigan was, frankly, Indians, American Indians, or at least memories of American Indians. During the War of 1812, you may know, British took Detroit. There were battles all over the place, and because the Indians tended to be on the side of the British, there were a lot of burning and general guerrilla warfare going on. Left the territory in a total state of disrepair, poor, and it took a long, long time. The population of Detroit was about 1,500 in 1812 when the war began. It did not get that high again until the 1820s. In any case, they moved to here. They first bought a house in Detroit for a short while, and then they started looking around. What did they find? Well, in 1824, a man by the name of George Johnson had bought some property from the U.S. government. It's called a patent. He was the original buyer, because the government owned all this land, and they sold it off at so much per acre. And he bought some property, which happened to be over here, where it used to be the NBD building. Now been an antique store for a while. I don't know what it is now. There's a plaque in the front indicating it's where the Simmons Tavern was. Well, first of it is the Johnson Tavern. He bought the property, he cleared some of it, he put up a log cabin which he used as a tavern. And for a while, Mr. Johnson made money the first year, but then some things happened. Coon Ten Eyck built his great tavern in Dearborn, which took a lot of the trade away. There's another tavern about in between here and there. And then the other thing that happened was the road that this tavern was on, Michigan Avenue now, then originally called the Sauk Trail, it's an Indian trail, then called the Chicago Road, was one of the worst roads you could ever imagine. Actually, we wouldn't think of it as a road. There was no roadway as such. They simply cut the trees about that high, low enough so the wagon could go over them, and that was it. Muddy, swampy, awful. People, the accounts of people who took that road over the period of the territorial period just hated it. Well, something had to be done. So about 1825, Governor Cass decided he needed a new road. And they built one. It's now called Territorial Road, up north of here. And the road that connected the Sauk Trail to the Territorial Road left north from, of course, Coon Ten Eyck's Tavern in Dearborn. So all the people who were going to take the Territorial Road never got here to what's now Wayne. They went north across to Plymouth. So George Johnson found he really couldn't make a go of it here. And so he sold out, built a new tavern up on the Territorial Road, and was quite prosperous for a while. He sold it to Stephen Simmons. What was it like here? Well, besides this awful road, there was a hardwood forest, great huge trees. It was dark. The land was, some of the land was good for farming, some of it was not, but mostly it was wet. Temperatures, according to the records that we found, temperatures here in the 1820s and 1830s were about the same as they are today, but it was significantly wetter then. It rained a lot more. And of course, there had not been all the draining that's taken place since that time. Mosquitoes were a major problem. Major problem. Everybody had malaria. It was known as the fever and ague, and everybody had it. Everybody knew that every year they would spend a couple of weeks in bed shivering and burning. And then it would go away and they'd get back to their work, and 6 months later it would come back and they'd suffer and then come back. That was just part of living in Michigan. There's also something called the Michigan itch that newcomers got. It's a form of erysipelas, apparently, a skin rash. Nobody knows what caused it. It doesn't seem to survive. It may have been due to nutritional problems. People couldn't get decent food. People ate pork, fried pork, and unleavened bread, potatoes, and maybe some corn. And that was it. Obviously, from a nutritional standpoint, not the best diet. It might have been tasty, but it wasn't the best diet. So that may have had something to do with it. There were other diseases. Yellow fever was a problem from time to time. Asiatic cholera didn't come until 1832, but when it did, it wiped out hundreds of people in the territory within 1832 and 1834. Goiter. Those of you older people may remember Michigan as part of the goiter belt. Before there was iodized salt here, people in Michigan got goiter because the salt that is here lacks iodine. And iodine is what keeps you from getting big goiters on your neck. So, in many ways, it was not a pleasant place to live. For these people, it was a land of opportunity. People started coming with the opening of the Erie Canal. Because with the Erie Canal, you could get here from New York City in 2 weeks. You could bring all of your goods by boat up the Hudson to Albany, by barge from Albany to Buffalo, and by boat from Buffalo to Detroit. You could arrive with all your goods easily. In those days, remember, transportation, bulk transportation, all had to do with water. You didn't have a river or a canal or a lake. It was very difficult to move anything. But here, all of a sudden, we had this network that got people here, and people started coming. And so when the Simmonses bought the tavern here, remember, it's still a log cabin. There's a picture, if any of you have ever read the book A Bark-Covered House, which is about Dearborn, in about this period. There's a picture, it's called the Thompson Tavern, but I'm sure it looks very much like what the Simmons Tavern looked like. It's a log cabin, very rough one. There's a sign outside saying, it's a tavern. There's a barn, there's a stockade for keeping people's stock, and that's all there is. Accounts of people who stayed at the Simmons Tavern indicate that essentially it was 2 rooms. One room where you sat and ate, another room where on one side of the room there was a planks, and women slept on that side and all together on those planks, and over here the men slept together on those planks. Often there was nothing to eat at the Simmons Tavern, and there are a couple stories of people who got up in the morning and had to leave without breakfast because Simmons family simply had nothing to offer them. So it was not the greatest hotel. But they were able to make it go because there were so many people coming through. So now there was enough to keep it going. They were able to buy property. Mr. Simmons bought property down in Springwells, some other places in Wayne County that he used for farming, and sometimes some he used for speculation. So all in all, although this tavern was pretty much a mess, all in all, he was a fairly prosperous guy. What happened? Why then did we end up again being executed in Detroit in September of 1830? Well, the usual explanation, and it certainly has a lot of validity, is alcohol. Although if everybody who drank a lot of alcohol in those days had been a killer, there would be nobody left. Everybody on the frontier got drunk all the time. You could not get anything done without alcohol. There's stories of people trying to hold temperance barn raisins. They simply offered people, water and milk and soft cider, and no work got done until they broke out the alcohol. The amount of drinking was phenomenal. In a city of 2,000 people, there were something like 50 taverns, licensed taverns. And you could also get bulk alcohol at any grocery store. You couldn't get it in drinks by the glass, but you could get it by the barrel. So drinking was essentially considered to be the lubricant of society. If you went to somebody's house, you got a lot to drink. If they came into your house, you gave them a lot to drink. which probably was okay, and this was men and women both. Women were supposed to drink wine and beer rather than whiskey, but probably a lot of them drank whiskey too. And it was not considered all that bad for a woman to get drunk as long as she was quiet. Well, somewhere along the line, between the time he probably went into the army, between then and the time he killed his wife, Stephen Simmons became a bad, violent drunk. He would get drunk, he would beat up his customers, he would beat his family, he would beat his wife. Now she, Lavana, according to stories, gave back measure for measure. She also was a violent drunk. She would beat the children with a stick, with a metal rod, drive them out of the house. She was not necessarily a pleasant person. By now, remember that when we're in 1830, he's 50 years old. She apparently is almost the same age. So they've been getting on. They've been drinking for a long time, not getting the best nutrition, probably not a whole lot of exercise. You can imagine what their bodies were like. Nevertheless, they were able to survive and go on until the June of 1830. At that time, Stephen was under a lot of pressure. His oldest daughter, Catherine, was getting divorced. Divorce was very rare in those days, but they caught her husband, Patrick McCarty, in adultery. He sent a lawyer out to do some investigation in Ypsilanti and found out he was living with another woman there. So they were able to get a not judicial, but a legislative divorce. They didn't go to court, they went to the legislature. The legislature passed a law saying that they were divorced. That took up a lot of his time that spring and early summer. Also, he had a lawsuit going on with one of his neighbors. The neighbor had contracted to bring in his crops the year before. And something had happened, it's not clear what, something had happened. And in the first week of June 1830, Stephen and his son David had to go to Detroit to be witnesses at the trial of this case in Wayne County Circuit Court. Amazingly, the notes that Judge William Woodbridge took at that trial still exist. This is a copy, obviously. At the Burton collection in the Woodbridge papers. I was happened to be reading through the papers, and there it was. St. Clair versus Simmons. And Judge Woodbridge, as we'll talk about later, was a compulsive note-taker. And he has listed all of the testimony in the case, for a couple pages. So it gives me some idea what the case is about, because, luckily, because the file itself has disappeared. The Bentley Library in Ann Arbor has microfilm of, I think, 900 circuit court cases from the territorial period. The territorial period is from 1805, Michigan was broken off from Indiana and became a territory, to 1836, when Michigan became a state. In those 31 years, there are about 900 cases that their files are preserved on microfilm at the Bentley Library. Unfortunately, this one, Simmons versus St. Clair, is missing from the microfilm. So I don't have the original papers, but I do have Judge Woodbridge's notes. Interestingly enough, also, if there ever was a criminal file on the United States versus Stephen G. Simmons, that also has disappeared. It may be in existence. There apparently are several boxes of court files that are in a place in Detroit called the Mark Twain Building. The problem is the Mark Twain Building is quarantined because it was asbestos. Nobody can go in there. Nobody can bring the files out. So if they're ever in there, it'll take maybe several years before anybody will know about it. In any case, they went to Detroit. They waited until about Thursday. They stayed at the famous Steamboat Hotel, which was the big hotel in Detroit at that time, run by Uncle Ben Woodward, one of the famous characters of that period. He was the captain of the artillery militia. He ran ferries across to Windsor. He was sort of the great entrepreneur of Detroit at that time. He ran stagecoaches, and he had this great hotel where everyone came to drink in the bar. All the meetings were held. They're sort of like Stephen's father's tavern had been in New York. So they stayed at Woodward's. They probably, according to the bill that Woodward submitted after Stephen was executed to his estate, They apparently ate a lot and drank a lot while they were there. On Thursday, their trial began, and on Friday, there was a verdict entered in favor of Stephen. He was happy. They stayed that Friday night at the hotel and no doubt celebrated again. Then they walked home. And they got home on Sunday. And according to the accounts, he and his wife started drinking to celebrate. They drank all through Sunday. Got up on Monday, kept drinking, fell asleep again, and got up on Monday evening. And Stephen was in a bad mood. So you might imagine after all that drinking, 15-year-old guy. He suspected his wife had been unfaithful. She was almost 15 and had been drinking just as long as he had. But he was convinced that she had been having an affair with one of the stagecoach drivers. And he started questioning one of their daughters about what had been going on while he was gone. He's been gone for a week. And whatever she said was apparently not very satisfactory, as he rushed into the bedroom and started berating her. And she then started berating back, and he started hitting her. And he hit her quite a bit. Some of the stories I'll talk about later that are in some history books are he hit her one blow and killed her. Dramatic. Pow! He was much bigger than she was. But in fact, the coroner's report after she was dead indicated many, many bruises on her body. That wasn't one blow that killed her. His children rushed in, trying to pull him off the mother, but it was too late. They took her body, took it outside, tried to get her some air. She was dead. The guests at the hotel, the tavern, and his one son put him in a shed, kept him there till morning. Then they put him on a cart along with Lavana's body and took him into Detroit to be arrested and indicted. So here we are, June 14th, 1830, the murder of Lavana Simmons. The grand jury met and took testimony from the children, from a few men who were staying at the tavern, and returned an indictment of murder against Stephen. He was taken to the Wayne County Jail, which is where, in Detroit, the library branch on Gratiot, near Old Hudson's building, is the site of the Wayne County Jail at that time. It was a two-story building, big block building, been built about 10 years earlier. Not a bad place to stay in jail. Mostly it was inhabited by debtors. This was still the time of debtors' prison. If someone owed you a debt and couldn't pay, you were entitled to have them arrested by the sheriff, and they just stay in jail until they could pay you back. How they could pay you back while they stayed in jail, no one ever has, but indeed, that was the way it worked. Stephen was in jail. He was chained to the floor. But other than that, he could bring in whatever things he wanted. He could get tobacco. He couldn't get any alcohol at that point. He could get tobacco. He could get food. His family could come and stay with him, and there's indications his kids did from time to time spend the night at the jail. After he was indicted and returned to jail, apparently Stephen had a pang of remorse because he tried to kill himself. When I first read this, it was in an Oakland County newspaper. It was only existed for a couple of years, called the Oakland Chronicle. Later became the Detroit Free Press. And I thought, well, you know, the Detroit paper, there was only one paper in Detroit at that time. Step back, another story. There had been a newspaper in Detroit since 1817. But in early 1830, a couple months before this all happened, one of the pressmen had gotten angry at his employer, the Detroit Journal, and burned the place down, leaving only one paper, the Northwestern Journal, which was a Whig paper, a sort of conservative paper, pro-temperance, pro-religion, as opposed to the other paper, which had been a Democratic Jacksonian paper, power of the people kind of paper. In any case, the story of the suicide was not in that paper, the Detroit paper, carried nothing about. According to the Oakland paper, he tried to cut his throat with a razor, but he was supposed to be shaving. And I looked at that and said, well, you know, how do people in Pontiac know what happened if the paper in Detroit says nothing about it? And so I just discounted it until I got the probate records. And there in the probate records are claims made by the doctor who sewed him up, by the jailer for the mess he caused, for having to hire a man to watch him now, and another man to come in and shave it. So apparently he did try to cut his own throat, failed, and there's also an indication in some of the court files that he tried again. Apparently one of his daughters tried to pass some poison to him, but failed. So we have one certain suicide attempt, another very likely suicide attempt. Which when you understand the circumstances of murderers in Michigan at that time, it's kind of strange. That he would be that, unless he really did feel contrition about killing his wife, he could very well have thought that he had very little to fear from the law. At that time, murder certainly was punishable by death by hanging in Michigan territory. But there had only been 2 hangings in the history of the territory, one of them under federal law, one of them under territorial law, both of them Indians. And to us it may seem despicable, but certainly to those people, hanging an Indian was not the same thing as hanging a white man. This is the way they thought. You know, in 1821, when these 2 Indians were hanged, there were only about 5 or 6 years since the last Indian raid on the city. So, although these 2 Indians were from Green Bay, nevertheless, it was considered to be a totally different matter from the simple murder. Now, I say from Green Bay, you may wonder why would they try and hang in Detroit? Just a little sidelight. At that time, the Michigan Territory, which is in blue here, included all of Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and the part of Minnesota that's east of the Mississippi River. So the judges in Detroit had jurisdiction over this whole territory. It made it tough for people out here, say Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. If they had a court case in Detroit, it took them essentially a year. They would have to leave home at Prairie du Chien sometime in July, travel up the Wisconsin River to Green Bay, take a ship from Green Bay around the Lower Peninsula to Detroit. So they'd be there when court started up in mid-September. Then, if their case wasn't one of the first ones heard, they probably couldn't leave until November, by which time, up in Mackinac, they were frozen in. They had to stay over winter in Detroit. Then only leave again in the spring to get back to Prairie du Chien. Get back to Prairie du Chien in June, 11 months after they left home. So it was tough to be a litigant if you were from Wisconsin in those days. And the 2 Indians who were hanged had killed white men, one an Army officer, the other one a trapper, around Green Bay. Other than that, there had been no executions in the Michigan Territory. There had been murders, absolutely. There was a man named Emery Fish, interesting name, in Pontiac, who had killed his landlady and her daughter with an axe. And he had been acquitted on the basis of insanity. And we think the insanity plea is something rather modern, but here in 1825, it was successfully done in Michigan. He was put in an asylum. There was a man named Levi Willard, another tavern owner, as a matter of fact, in 1828, killed his brother in a drunken brawl. It's 4th of July, they both got drunk. They swung knives at each other and the brother died. Levi Willard was acquitted of murder, convicted of manslaughter, and got 2 years. Another man, John McLaren, a year later, had a similar incident with one of his best friends. Killed him in a drunken brawl. Got 3 months for manslaughter. Juries generally refused to bring verdicts of murder because, well, he was deaf. And killings in a drunken brawl were not taken very seriously. Unless apparently you killed your wife in a drunken brawl. At that time, as I said, murder, the intentional killing of another person, was punishable by death by hanging. The other possible charge was manslaughter. And many people then and now think that Stephen should have been charged with manslaughter. After all, he was drunk. He didn't know what he was doing. He did not have the ability to form the intent to kill. It wasn't like he took a gun and shot her, took a knife and stabbed her. He beat her with his fists. And couldn't we say that he intended to hurt her but not to kill, that the drunkenness took away his ability to form the intent to kill, and therefore it's manslaughter. Well, the problem with that was that at that time, and for a long, long time in Michigan, intoxication was not a defense. If you got drunk, that was considered to be your problem. And so you were presumed to have the ability to form the intent to kill. And so under the law at that time, Stephen had to be indicted for murder. Jury could have found him not guilty, or found him not guilty of murder and guilty of manslaughter, because we'll see they decided not to. But that was the state of homicide law in Michigan at that time. Now there was one other hanging to talk about before we get to Stephen. That again was under federal law. I make a distinction in my book, and generally lawyers do, between federal law and state law. Before Stephen was executed, there was one execution under territorial law at that time, and that was the Indian came out of Michigan, who killed a trapper in Green Bay. The other Indian, Catawba, who killed the Army officer also near Green Bay, was charged under a federal statute because he killed an officer on Indian land. And there was a private, James Brown, who in Mackinac in 1829 shot and killed his corporal, no doubt with good reason, and was tried for murder because it was done at the fort. Mackinac was a federal crime. Tried by the federal prosecutor, and he was found guilty of murder, and eventually was hanged on Mackinac. We don't know where. We don't know where his body went. Interesting enough, because it was a federal crime, a pardon had to come from Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was not the kind of man to pardon a murderer. Lewis Cass, the governor of Michigan, on the other hand, was a man who liked to make everybody happy. And so there are various occasions when murderers came before him, he very often gave them a pardon, let them walk away, because he felt bad for them. In fact, there was a very similar case involving a soldier at Fort Gratiot, which is now Fort Huron, who shot off the fort, shot another soldier, maybe by accident, maybe not by accident, was found guilty of manslaughter. The jury again refused to return a verdict of murder, and Cass even pardoned him for manslaughter. Came to serve no time. So Stephen could think that sitting here being charged with a territorial statute, Governor Cass as a backstop, he probably thought he could get away with this. There was a very good chance that he would either be acquitted or he would be found guilty of manslaughter, spend a couple of years at most in jail, and that would be the end of it. But again, as I said, if he felt that, he failed to understand how serious these people, the killing of a woman, particularly of a wife, was. What about the court? Since I'm a lawyer, of course, that's I think it's important to me. The courthouse was what's then called the territorial capitol. It was a building, a huge steeple in what is now Capitol Square, Detroit. There's a statue of Stephen Mason there. And it was the tallest building in the territory. You could go up to the top, to the bell tower, look out over the lake. It and St. Anne's Catholic Church were the only two tall buildings in town at that time. The population was only about 2,000. Most of the people lived below Jefferson. They lived between the river and Jefferson Avenue. So that was the courthouse. Who were the lawyers? Well, Stephen's defense attorney was this man, George Alexander O'Keefe. One of the first Irish attorneys in Detroit. He was actually born in Ireland, educated at Trinity College in Dublin. Came to New York originally and studied law there. Then came to Michigan, I think probably because he was Catholic, and this was very much a Catholic town. Remember that when the American troops first arrived in Detroit in the 1790s, there was only one U.S. citizen in the whole territory. Everyone else was either English, or most of them left, and French. All the French were Catholics. They all went to St. Anne's Church. And even by 1830, the balance was about 50% French, 50% what they called Bostonians, English Americans. And so it was very much, probably more than any other city in America, except maybe Baltimore, a Catholic town. And that may very well have attracted George O'Keeffe. George O'Keeffe was one of those very colorful characters. He was very dramatic. He's the John Barrymore of attorneys. He loved to make grand gestures. He's tall, a lot of hair, and according to every story I've seen, he loved to use big words. He loved to use a lot of emotion. According to one story, he also knew a lot of swear words. He was the life of the party, every party he went to, very much one of the legendary characters of territorial Michigan. Like many Irishmen, he never married. Brought his sister over to keep house for him. Later became a probate judge. The prosecutor was this fellow. This is B.F.H. Witherell, Benjamin Franklin Hawkins Witherell. Also known because he was rather plump as Big Fat Hog Witherell. But despite that name, he was a very popular man. His father had been one of the judges, was not then the territorial secretary, James Witherell. Sort of interesting story. He was named judge at the beginning of the territorial period, even though he'd never studied law. He was a doctor. But he was a very good friend of Thomas Jefferson, and therefore that got him the appointment as territorial judge. B.F.H. Hawkins was a very good attorney, later was a judge himself in Wayne County Circuit Court. He was also one of the early historians of Michigan, published a number of articles in newspapers regarding the old days. He loved to talk to the French people. He spoke French very well. He loved to collect the stories of the French Canadians who were here and who still lived in the territory. If you look at the jury list, there's still a lot of French names. Most of them lived either in the city of Detroit, they lived in Hamtramck, or they lived along the, what they call the East Coast, Grosse Pointe, up that way. The French, you may know this, when the King of France gave out property, he didn't dole it out the way the U.S. government did, in squares, rectangles. He would give every person about 200 yards of waterfront, and then as far back as they wanted to go. Miles. 2 or 3 miles. Far, because, if you're just a farmer, it doesn't matter. It's all wilderness. What matters doesn't matter how far back you go. But so if you look at the lot, for example, if you look at Grosse Pointe today, you'll see the streets and lot lines run narrow and long, rather than square blocks as you would see here. That was because those were French grants for the most part. And he was very popular with the French. He was the prosecutor. Also, with him was the Attorney General of Michigan, William Fletcher. Mr. Fletcher was simply there for show. It was an important case. His name had to be on the thing. He certainly essentially sat there and let Witherell do all the work. With O'Keeffe was a man named Henry Cole, who was another attorney in Detroit, who unfortunately died young, but who was very well known for his knowledge of the law. George O'Keeffe probably didn't know very much about the law. He was sort of those larger-than-life characters who was good at arguing, was good at talking, maybe not that good with the books. George O'Keeffe, and I apologize to any Irish people here, loved liquor. He was unfortunately one of, sort of almost a caricature of the happy Irishman at the time. And eventually that killed him. He died rather young, in his 40s, a broken down man. But at this time, he was at the top of his game. However, there's a very ironic story that I have to tell you. When he first came to Michigan in about 1821, he started meeting friends here. It was a small town, very small legal community. And at one point in the summer of 1821, the first grist mill in Michigan was opening up in Pontiac. And so all the important people in the territory went up there to have a grist mill opening, I guess, you know, in college. And they drank and they had fun. They were sitting around the barn drinking, and they were essentially making people do like challenges. If you didn't make the challenge, you had to strip down your underwear and dance in front of all the people. They took one of the young men who later became a Supreme Court justice and dangled him out the window by his heels. And they're going to do something to George O'Keefe, but he ran away, hid in the barn. And they decided they were going to burn the barn down to make him come out. But unfortunately, he came out before the barn caught fire. So a grand time was held by all. This included the judges, Solomon Sibley, William Woodridge were there, the governor was there. All the important people in the territory were there having loads of fun. Male people were there having loads of fun. On the way back to Detroit, they're walking back to Detroit from Pontiac. In those days, because of the swamp, meant going to Mount Clemens and then down along the coast. And they came upon, they're walking along, probably still drinking, they came upon an old Frenchman sitting there fishing. And they decided that he committed some offense. And as a joke, they were going to hang him. They put a rope around his neck and actually over the branch of a tree. Imagine the feeling of this poor Frenchman, these three large Englishmen saying something he probably didn't even understand, putting a rope around his neck, and then pulling him off his feet. And then apparently O'Keefe was pulling the rope and no one told him to stop. And so finally, Dr. Chamberlain, who was with them, said, "You better let him down." And they did. Because O'Keefe himself came very close to being involved in a murder of his own due to drink. So those were the attorneys. Stephen Simmons paid his attorneys with promissory notes, secured by the mortgages on the tavern. We know this because the family refused to pay after it all was over. And George O'Keefe had to go to the Supreme Court of Michigan to get his money. It took him years. And in the Supreme Court file, which is at the Bentley Library, the actual notes that he sent, that Simmons signed over to O'Keefe and to Cole. If he had been poor, he could have been having an assigned attorney, but he was a wealthy man, at least appeared to be a wealthy man, and so he had to pay for his own attorneys. What about the court? Again, being a lawyer, this sort of thing interests me. At that time, the Michigan Supreme Court had three excellent attorneys. This man was the oldest of them, Solomon Sibley. He had come to Detroit only a year after the United States Army entered the place. At that time, he was only the second attorney in Michigan. He was the first mayor of Detroit. He was a representative to Congress. He was a little bit of everything. And in 1825, he was appointed by John Quincy Adams to the Michigan Supreme Court. He was a Whig, sort of almost a Republican, but not quite. We're not quite there yet. But he was a fairly a guy who got along with everybody, and so his politics never really seemed to hurt him very much. The chief judge was this fellow, William Woodridge. Sort of cadaverous-looking face. I hope this was somewhat later in his career. He was about 50 at the time of this. He was about the same age as Simmons. William Woodridge had come to Detroit. He'd been living in Cincinnati, but in Marietta, Ohio. He had been a friend of Governor Cass. When Governor Cass was appointed governor at the time that the Americans took back the territory from the British in 1814, he called up William Woodridge to be the secretary of the territory, Secretary of State, territorial secretary. And Woodridge wasn't very happy about this, but he figured maybe he can make some money doing this. He came up, spent the rest of his career complaining about the fact he couldn't make any money in Michigan, but he never left. He was territorial secretary. He also was, for a time, the representative in Congress. Well, Michigan was a territory that did not have an actual representative or senator, but they had a person who would go there, talk to the representatives, and sort of behave like almost like a lobbyist, I guess. Woodridge was eventually senator. He ended up being one of the richest men in Michigan by the time he died in the 1860s. But at this time, he was the chief judge of the Supreme Court. He was a hypochondriac. He constantly thought he was dying. He lived to be in his 70s, so apparently he wasn't dying very fast. But he always felt that he was in poor health, and often he would be absent from the court, claiming that he was something wrong with him. Now taking pills of some kind. Sibley, I didn't mention this, by this time, Solomon Sibley, who had always been a very active man, had a problem. He was essentially deaf. And you can see it, people mention it, and also you can see in his handwriting, there's obviously something neural going on. His handwriting goes from being very nice handwriting, being very jerky. There's something maybe brain-related going on. He was essentially deaf, and the other judges had to whisper to him and tell him what was going on. And the third judge, they sat in threes, was this guy, Henry Chipman. Henry Chipman had come to Michigan more recently in the 1820s from Baltimore. He had been appointed again by John Quincy Adams. His name was also a Whig, as was Woodbridge. And his problem was he had a stutter. So he hardly ever asked questions in court. And in fact, he also relied very heavily on Woodbridge to take notes. One of the problems with the murder case is that Woodbridge was there for the jury selection, but he was not there for the actual testimony. He was sick. He was off. The other two heard the actual testimony, but we don't have Woodbridge's notes because he wasn't there. It was very nice to have them. So those were the judges. Now, I told you they were from the Michigan Supreme Court, but in fact, they sat, in this case, as Wayne County Circuit Court. At that time, and for many years after, the two were had the same judges. So if you were a Supreme Court judge, you were also a Wayne County Circuit Court judge. At this time, also, you were a Oakland County Circuit judge, a Monroe County Circuit Court judge, a Lenawee County Circuit Court judge, a judge for every county there was. You had traveled each county twice a year to hold a court. Obviously, this did not go over very well with these men. One's deaf, one stutters, and one thinks he's dying all the time. Getting on a horse and traveling to Marshall or to Monroe was not something they really enjoyed. They preferred to stay in Wayne County in Detroit, and did their best to keep the legislature from passing laws that made them leave Detroit. So they were sitting in the Capitol building as a Wayne County Circuit Court. Trial started on July 6th, 1830. And the sheriff who was in charge of bringing in jurors, prospective, would be called veneer men, V-E-N-I-R-E-M-E-N, because it was called a writ of veneer, a writ to come here, bring you here. There was this whole system in Wayne County of appointing jurors. Each township had to appoint 50 grand jurors and 50 trial jurors every year. Unfortunately, they didn't do it. So there was always a shortage of jurors in Wayne County. And the sheriff had sent out writs to 26 men, because they were all men, juries in those days, to come in to be jurors in this case. Only 19 of them showed up. And they started the jury selection process. They put 12 men in the box, and then the attorneys were allowed to ask questions of you see it on TV. Questions of the jurors. The three judges are sitting up behind the bench, and it quickly became clear what the strategy of George O'Keefe was going to be. It was to try to get rid of every juror possible. Keep this going as long as he could, hope for a mistrial, or maybe if he could find 12 men who he thought would give his client a fair trial, that'd be even better, but mostly we're going to make them work for the jurors. So that first day, they had 19 prospective jurors. Grand total of 0 were seated as jurors. All of them were either excused for cause or excused on a peremptory charge. In other words, peremptory excuse is when simply you say, I don't like that guy, I want him gone. And under the law of Michigan at that time, the defendant was allowed, in a capital crime, 35 peremptory challenges. The government was allowed 2. And in this case, Simmons attorneys used 34 of the 35, the government used both of their 2. But that doesn't count the people who were dismissed for cause. Meaning they thought they'd already figured out that Simmons was guilty, and they were willing to say it to the court. Now, probably a lot of those people just didn't want to be on the jury. We see that today. But a lot of them had made up their minds, because it was a famous case. It's a well-known, scandalous matter. It's a small population, and it didn't take long for the word to get around when it happened. So that was Tuesday. They broke on Wednesday. They had other work to do. Stephen came back into court on Thursday, the 8th of July, and the sheriff had been told to bring in more jurors. And he couldn't send out any more veneer summonses. Essentially, he went from door to door pulling men in. If he found somebody on the street, you got pulled in as a juror. He ended up with 48 men as potential jurors on Thursday. They went through the whole bunch and ended up with a total of 4 for the panel. So 44 were excused for one reason or another. And the court, at this point, tired of the whole thing, said, we'll be back on Monday. Friday, we have other things to do. We have another sentencing to do. We have a couple of trials to do. We'll be back on Monday. We came back on Monday, and they told the sheriff, you better well have enough people this time. We're tired of this. Usually, we pick a jury in half an hour. We bring in 14 guys, we get a 12-man jury with no trouble. We don't know what's going on here, but you better bring in a bunch next time. So next time the sheriff came in with 61. Remember, they already had they only needed 8 more. We brought in 61 jurors. And it took all of those 61 to end up with 8 more trial jurors. And one of the things O'Keefe was doing was trying to break through the old boy system. It was the easiest thing to do when you had to bring in jurors through the sheriff is to keep going to the same people. People have their stores and their offices near the courthouse. People you know are sound. People you know are not going to come up with a crazy verdict. People who are in city and territorial government. Maybe they are a sheriff. Maybe they were a constable. Maybe they're a city commissioner. People who are part of the establishment, we would say now. Those people ended up on the, if you look at the jury list for cases, those people are on the juries time and time again. And one of the reasons for having the system where each township sent in names of people was to break that system. The system had broken down because township clerks just didn't do it. So when they got there on the first day and the Tuesday, O'Keefe looked around and saw the same old faces. And he knew that these prosperous Detroit businessmen were not going to acquit his client. Didn't have a chance. And his thought was if he kept bringing them back, making them pick up more people and more people, eventually they were going to get down to people who were more like his client, who were not prosperous, who lived out in the country someplace, like Wayne, like Pekin Township, or like Hamtramck, and would more likely give his client a fair shake. And that's one of the reasons it took 128 jurors to end up with 12. They finished sometime in the afternoon on the Monday, July the 12th. Well, I'm sure everyone was just exhausted going through 61 veneermen that day. The court told them to keep going, start the trial. As I said, for Tuesday and Thursday, Judge Woodridge was there. We have his notes. For the Monday, he was not. We don't have the notes from the Monday. And that's when the actual testimony, the government brought in Mr. Witherell, the Witherell, brought in Stephen's children to testify against him. And according to the reports that we have, they were the key witnesses. They testified about how he beat their mother so many times in the past, how he beat her this time. Obviously, had the crowd in tears. And also remember that there was a full house in the audience every day. It was a very hot summer. Nevertheless, people filled the courtroom every day, smoking, spitting, wearing the heavy woolen clothing. It probably smelled really bad. But one of the things we have to remember about our ancestors is they didn't worry about smells as much as we do. They were used to garbage in the street. They had pigs running loose in the streets of Detroit and every other town to eat the garbage that people would throw out into the streets. There was no pavement. People didn't bathe very often. People certainly didn't brush their teeth very often. Light smelled, literally smelled to them. Children testified. Then some of the people who had been witnesses, who had been maybe staying at the tavern, testified. And then the court broke, came back, and testimony finished. Stephen essentially put on no defense, because his only hope was not in any witness who could come in, but in the oratorical skills of George O'Keefe. The prosecutor, Witherell, gave his closing statement to the jury, essentially saying, look, it's pretty obvious what happened here. You know, man killed his wife, the woman, one person in the world she could hope to turn to for support, and that person killed her in front of their children. There's only one thing you can do, gentlemen. Murder. O'Keefe got up. We don't have the exact words, but we have sort of general indication of what he said. And he essentially, although relied on the alcohol defense, although it wasn't a legal defense, he made the point that, look, he was drunk, didn't know what he was doing. You can't send a man to the gallows if he didn't know what he was doing. And understand, he's already lost everything. He's lost his wife, he's lost his family. Do not make him lose his life. I'm sure it was very dramatic, and as we, a lot of arm movements and a lot of voice going up and down, and for those people in those times, it went on for hours. Because that's what they like. They like to have arguments going on for hours. It's a famous story from about that time in the U.S. Supreme Court. There was a land case involving a land fraud, and an attorney named Story from Massachusetts, who was later a famous Supreme Court justice himself, argued for one of the parties. Now these days, if you go to the U.S. Supreme Court, you have maybe 15, 20 minutes to argue your case. Story argued for a week. What he found to say, I can't imagine, but that's what they like. They like to have, and this was entertainment. They didn't have television, didn't have radio. Going to hear somebody argue their case was probably the only thing that made their week. So O'Keefe went on for a while, the jury went out. By 5 o'clock, they had not returned a verdict. They were sent back to a hotel under the guard of the two sheriffs, constables, and came back the next morning. Stephen was sitting in his jail cell, and the jailer came in and said, it's time to go back to court, they called for you. Went back, he stood next to his lawyer, and the juror pronounced a sentence of guilty of murder. The judges set a sentencing date for July 26th and told him to come back. We have an account of the sentencing because there was a journalist named Kelvin Colton who was on his way up to the UP to study the Indian tribes up there, happened to be in Detroit on the day of the sentencing. And because it was something unusual, he wrote a story about it for the New York newspaper. He later put that story in a book he wrote about his travels, and it ended up in a volume of the Michigan Pioneer and Historical Collections. One of the first things I saw when I started investigating this case was his statement about the sentencing. He has Stephen coming in to court, sort of slumped over, a huge man, face of a Roman god. Clean shaven. Men did not wear beards in that particular period. Wearing a suit of clothes, tall, robust man. He'd been dry for several weeks now. Hadn't been able to get any drink in jail, so he was looking better. He was healthier. The judge asked him if he had anything to say. He said nothing more than I said before. And the judge then went into Judge Woodbridge, who was back on the bench at this point, unhappy that the other two judges had made him do the sentencing. He later indicated in the newspaper that he was very upset about that. Why me? He gave a long speech. First, he pointed out that Stephen had been given every possible protection the law allows. He had great attorneys. He had a jury that he had chosen out of all these people. They'd gone to great lengths to bring in people that his attorneys would accept as jurors. He had not been required to testify against himself. He had been given every possible protection of the law, and yet he'd been found guilty. Now he'd been found guilty, presumptions of innocence no longer applied. Now we had to do something about it. And Judge Woodbridge gave essentially the only possible sentence under the law, which was death by hanging. Since it was a murder, that was the only possible sentence. The only possible way out was to go to Governor Cass and ask for a pardon. Stephen was returned back to his jail cell to await execution, which had been set for September 24. So we had a 2-month interval between the time of sentencing and the time of the execution. During that time, George O'Keefe moved for a new trial, arguing that there had been some technical problems with the jury. He hadn't been given the names of the jurors early enough, and the court essentially told him to get lost. The jailer at this point gave Stephen a break. He let him buy a gallon of whiskey. We have actually the charge. Again, the probate records show the charge from the store, Eli Cook's store, for this gallon of whiskey, and Stephen spent the rest of those 2 months sitting in his cell, smoking and drinking, and probably feeling sorry for himself. However, the story in the newspaper is that in fact Stephen showed no signs of remorse during any of this period. Like other people say he did show signs of remorse, but many people said he did not. He showed a hard heart. The local Protestant clergy weren't going to let that go by, and they started visiting him in jail. They were allowed to go in and visit any prisoner they wanted under the law. And they started peckering him, getting at him about his soul. And one of them, Parson Noah Wells from the Presbyterian Church in Detroit, actually made a contact with Stephen. Possibly because Wells himself was an older man. He had been a manual laborer before he became a minister. And he somehow made a connection with Stephen. And they started talking, and Stephen eventually came to accept God, I guess. Or at least he said he did. There was some skepticism in town whether he really did or not, whether it was just a typical man about to be hanged, just covering his bets. But Parson Wells did try to bring Stephen around to understanding of what he had done and the consequences. The person who was responsible for conducting the execution was the sheriff under the law. The sheriff was a man named Thomas Knapp, K-N-A-P-P. And he was a deacon of one of the churches. He'd been the sheriff for a very short period of time, about 6 months, and he decided he simply couldn't do it. The stories that have always been told was that he, on the eve of the hanging, he decided he couldn't do it, and there was an emergency call for someone who would do it. In fact, according to the records of the Office of the Territorial Secretary, which is also at the State Archives in Michigan, he resigned 2 weeks ahead of time. This day, September 10, 1830, is notation that Thomas Knapp resigns as sheriff of Wayne County. Some investigation indicates there was a reason why he did that. Now, a lot of sheriffs didn't want to hang people across the country. Very often they would hire somebody, pay them money to come in and be the hangman. But Knapp was in an unusual situation. He knew that he was not going to be sheriff for very much longer. He had been made sheriff by James Witherell, B.M.H. Witherell's father, as part of a political maneuver to get around Governor Cass. Governor Cass was off giving a speech someplace in the east, and when he was gone, James Witherell was acting governor. He could do whatever he wanted, and he kicked out the old sheriff, who was an ally of Cass, who was a Democrat, brought in Knapp. Witherell was a Whig. So, bad blood. Well, that was a valid appointment, but on the other hand, under the law, Knapp could only be sheriff until the legislature reconvened in December. At that point, the legislature would have to reappoint him. And he knew, because they were mostly Democrats, that wasn't going to happen. So when he resigned at the beginning of September, he knew he only had a couple more months. It was an important job, not because he was the main police officer, because there's some great benefit to being a sheriff. You were also the tax collector. And you got a percentage of every tax you collected. One of the great ways of making money in the territory was to be the sheriff. But tax time was passed. So he was looking to, he's going to hang this man, not make much more money, and still get kicked out of office. He just decided, not going to do it. Well, the story also goes, I know it's getting late, but we're almost at the point. The story also goes that Ben Woodward, the owner of the Steamboat Hotel, jumped up and said, I will do it. I'm a tough little Yankee, came here in 1812, I'll do it. Actually, Woodward was also the coroner. And by law, the coroner took over from the sheriff. So once the sheriff resigned, as a matter of law, Woodward had the duty to hang Stephen Simmons. He jumped at it. They built a scaffold up in front of the jail, in the middle of Gratiot Avenue, right there by where the library is. The bill for building the scaffold is still in the papers of the Burton collection. It was about $25 for lumber and labor to build the scaffold. And Uncle Ben decided that a lot of people were going to come in. You know, hangings in those days in America and England attracted a lot of people. Said there was no TV, no radio, no movies. A hanging was entertainment for a lot of people. And so Uncle Ben decided he would prepare for that. He was an entrepreneur, remember. He set up grandstands around the scaffold. He invited a band in to play military music while the people were waiting for the execution. And in fact, thousands of people came in. Remember, the city of Detroit had a population of 2,000. There were 2,000 people watching this hanging, and a lot of people in Detroit didn't go. People came in from all over the countryside. Came in their wagons, slept in the fields, slept in the hotels, probably spent a lot of money at the Steamboat Hotel, hopefully for that. There was this huge crowd of 2,000 waiting. The night before the execution, Stephen called his attorney Cole in and said, I want to write my will. And they sat down, and he dictated to Cole. Cole wrote it up, and Stephen signed it. And the witnesses are kind of interesting because they are Cole, Ad Merritt, who was the marshal, Owen Aldrich, who was the jailer, and Israel Noble, who was the sexton. The sexton is the person who essentially was the gravedigger of town. So you had the gravedigger, the marshal, and the jailer as witnesses for his will. He divided the property up among his children. Mostly his daughters got most of it. His sons were given the tavern, but he knew that the tavern was already under a mortgage to the attorneys, so it really wasn't worth that much as a bequest. The next morning dawned. Stephen was put on, he bought new clothes. We know from the probate record, he bought new clothes for the hanging, a new pair of boots. And when the time came, there was this crowd of 2,000 people surrounding the scaffold. There were a lot of other people, too, who couldn't get that close. And among them were 3 people who left reports of what happened. There was Friend Palmer, his name's Friend, who had come to Detroit when he was 5, stayed there until he died in 1906, and left this book, Early Days in Detroit. He was 7 at the time. And he and his good friend, Ari Roberts, who was 21, and their good friend, Eben Wilcox, who was 9, climbed out to the top of a shed in BFH Rule's backyard to watch the hanging. And they ate peanuts, by the way, at the time. Now later, many years later, Ari Roberts said he was very upset that there were so many women and children at the hanging. This is a man who brought a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old and peanuts to watch the execution. In any case, Friend Palmer and Ari Roberts left the 2 best accounts of the actual execution. The newspaper, Northwestern Journal, had a story about the execution, but really didn't say anything about the actual event. It talked about the crowd, talked about the morality of the whole thing, said nothing about what actually happened. There was one other account that existed at one time, but currently it's been lost. There was a fellow named Walter Watson, who 50 years later petitioned the Michigan legislature to be paid for his militia time spent during the execution of Stephen Simmons. He had played the drums, marching behind Stephen Simmons to the scaffold. He said he was never paid. He wanted $3 plus interest since 1830 in the legislature. No indication he ever got it. According to Roberts and to Fred Palmer, when the time came, Uncle Ben came out and Stephen came out and was surrounded by a couple under sheriffs. He marched up, went up the steps to the scaffold, stood there, looked out over the crowd, nodded his head, went back, rope was put around his neck, and boom, down he went. Essentially, Roberts and Palmer agree on that. Whether they put a hood over his head, they disagree on all the details like that. They agree that he got up there, he looked around, didn't say anything, stood back, and down he went. This is important because the story of Simmons became very popular because of the story that he sang a hymn. You may have heard this story. That, in fact, it's in George Catlin's book. It's the highlight of George Catlin's story about Simmons. That Simmons, when we got up to the scaffold, walked out from the crowd, gave essentially a temperance sermon, and then sang a hymn in a very loud, high voice, without an accompaniment, no band, nobody else singing, solo. Then stepped back and sang. And that has become essentially the story of the hanging through the years. What I discovered was that story was never told by anyone until 1879. Nobody, no newspaper, no witness, nobody said anything. And as I said, Palmer and Roberts both said that he just said nothing. Because Catlin put it in his book, which is a very popular book. It's been in every account since then. You know, if somebody were to write us the story tomorrow, hadn't read my book, they'd put in that he sang a hymn before he was hanged. Trying to find out where did the story come from. And I think I did find out. In 1879, there was a fellow named Edwin Jerome, who was one of the early businessmen in Detroit. His family company still exists in over by St. Clair Shores. They were surveyors. And he was giving a speech to the Michigan Historical Society, and essentially about his family. And he talked about where his family came from, and all of a sudden he switched to the Simmons case. And he told the story about how the murder had taken place and about the execution. He told the story about Stephen Simmons singing this hymn and telling this temperance speech and then being hanged. And George Catlin picked it up 50 years later, used it in his book. Well, there's some problems with it. One thing, as I said, nobody else ever told that story until that time. Mr. Jerome, at that point, was in his 70s. He'd been run over by a carriage a few years before that. It was in terrible pain the rest of his life. He only had about 6 months to live at that time. And I think it's very possible that he'd essentially embellished the story. He doesn't even say in his speech that he actually saw this happen. He may have. He was old enough, and he was there in Detroit. He may have seen it happen. I think, as many other people have a tendency to do, speaking 50 years after the event, he added details. Unfortunately, George Catlin was not maybe as suspicious as he should have been, and so he ended up with the story. Well, that's the story of my book. The rest of the end of the story of Stephen Simmons. His body was cut down. One of the things that was very interesting about the whole ceremony was it was very different from the typical hanging ceremony back east. In the eastern part of the United States and in many other places, a hanging was intended to make a lesson to the common people. It was government saying, you better behave. And so essentially the man to be hanged was humiliated. He was dressed in white with a hood on. He was put in a wagon next to it. He had to sit on his coffin. He was dragged out to the local church. He was preached at by the local preacher. They came back to the place he was going to be hanged. All the mayor and all the councilmen got up and gave speeches. He had to get up and apologize to everybody in the world, and then he was hanged. And then his body was cut down and given to a doctor to use for vivisection. None of that happened here. Stephen Simmons walked straight from the jail to the scaffold. Nobody preached at him. Nobody made him wear funny clothes. There was no. Essentially, people tried. There was a great feeling at the time. You can see it from many of the things people said. They felt sorry for him. They felt he had to die, but yet they felt it was a terrible tragedy. They did not feel in any way that this was somehow a lesson for people to learn. This was something that had to be done, but it was awful. Many of the people in civic offices didn't go to the hanging. Governor Cass picked that morning to leave for Ohio to visit his mother. None of the judges were there. There's no indication that even the attorneys were there, that O'Keefe or Cole were there. Stephen pretty much went to his death alone. There is a story told that one of his sons brought in a wagon full of people to watch. The guy killed his mother. But after the execution, Stephen was cut down. A local cabinet maker made a coffin and charged the estate for taking the coffin out to the homestead, out to the tavern. He apparently was buried somewhere around the tavern. We don't know where. We don't know where Lavana was buried either. She was probably buried out there. No grave was ever found. Obviously now it's all been worked over. Never going to be found. And that was the end of Stephen Simmons. Now, the rest of the story of the book is about the end of capital punishment in Michigan. And now we've really gone pretty late. I just want to give you a very quick. When Michigan became a state in 1835, there were efforts already to abolish capital punishment. There have been anti-capital punishment movements in the United States since the beginning of the country. They've never gone very far. Splitting capital punishment into first and second degree murder was about as far as anybody could get in the progress. At the Constitutional Convention in 1835, there was a motion, but it was turned down. In 1838, in the legislature, there was an attempt that was turned down. In 1843, there was a major attempt in the House of Representatives. A guy named Flavius Littlejohn from Allegheny County, Charles Bush from Livingston County, put forth a motion to change the punishment for murder to life imprisonment and solitary confinement and hard labor. And there were 3 days of speeches about it. One of the interesting things about the speeches because you've heard them all. There's not a single argument for or against capital punishment you've heard today that wasn't made in 1843. And there are none that were made in 1843 that you have, they're all the same. No, the arguments for and against capital punishment haven't changed in 200 years. In 1843, it didn't pass. But Flavius Littlejohn then went into the Senate in 1846. As part of a revision of the statutes, they were able to pass a provision. Eventually, the House accepted it, and in May of 1846, the governor signed the bill abolishing capital punishment for murder. It became effective in 1847. Since then, there have been many, many attempts to reinstate capital punishment. All have failed, but some of them were close. At one point, there had to be a governor's veto. Another time, it was put up for a vote, and capital punishment was defeated only because the Upper Peninsula voted 80% against capital punishment. In 1961, at the most recent Constitutional Convention in Michigan, a young Republican lawyer by the name of Eugene Wanger decided it was time to give the abolishment of capital punishment constitutional protection. And he started a movement in the convention that eventually was given a huge bipartisan support, Democrats and Republicans, passed almost unanimously. So now today, in our Constitution, there's a provision that you cannot punish people by capital punishment.
The line will be closed in 15 minutes. Please make your final questions.
I'm almost done. To overturn that would require not just a vote of the legislature, but also a vote of the people. And there's been no effort to do that since 1962. And that's the story of capital punishment, the story of Stephen Simmons. Thank you very much for giving me a long time to talk. I didn't realize I could talk that long. If anybody has any questions, I'm glad to answer.
What was the name of the hymn that he sung?
Oh, the hymn. Well, let me read it to you. Show pity, O Lord, or Lord, forgive. Let a repenting rebel live. Are not thy mercies full and free? May not a sinner trust in thee? Thy crimes are great that can't surpass the power and glory of thy grace. Great God, thy nature has no bound, so let thy pardoning love be found.
Thank you.
You said that he and his wife were buried somewhere out there. Did you mean that they were buried somewhere in Detroit or in...
No, on the tavern property over by the river. But there was no, all there was here in Wayne was the tavern, essentially. There were a couple other farms. It wasn't until the tavern was bought and different men took told them that Wayne started becoming a city for town. Yes, I saw a hand over there, yes.
What was the Watson name? My great-great-grandfather, the family lived in Denton, and my great-great-grandfather's obituary refers to the fact that he played the fife at the last hanging.
Really?
And he was Watson. He was Watson.
Well, you might be very well have been the same. I'd like to see
so
that,
curious.
if you could get me a copy of it.
I was looking all afternoon for it. We've got it. I've got it. Yeah.
But apparently that was the person. We see that's a story he told 50 years later trying to get his pay plus interest.
That's interesting.
Please have some refreshments. There's pop and cookies back here.
And also, of course, I have to say, the book is available for sale in the back. There are also, if you'd like to think about it, there are order forms to send in order from the publisher. I'll be glad to sign up any copy that anybody buys. I thank you very much for your attention. Just took you through probably the longest speech.
Everybody, the wine and cheese party's coming up September 30th, and tickets are on sale. October 9th, 10th, and 11th, we're having our book sale, and I handed out flyers for our next